She was just a little girl. No lawyer, no fancy clothes, no one to speak for her. The courtroom was packed, cameras flashing, people whispering, calling her father a criminal. But she didn't see the judge. She didn't see the crowd. All she saw was her dad, sitting there in handcuffs, eyes full of tears he didn't want her to see. They said he was guilty, that he'd done something unforgivable. But deep down she knew the truth, because every night before bed he'd tell her, "Baby, no matter what happens, never stop believing in what's right." So that day, she stood. Her voice shook, her hands trembled. And still, she said it loud enough for the whole world to hear, "My dad is innocent." The courtroom froze. Reporters stopped writing. Even the judge leaned back, eyes wide, speechless. And in that moment, everyone knew something had just changed. Because sometimes, it doesn't take power to move mountains. It just takes the courage of a little girl who refuses to stay silent. They said her father was a thief, a man who stole from the company that trusted him, a man who betrayed the people who gave him a chance. That's what every headline said, every whisper in her neighborhood, every face that looked away when she walked by. But she knew better. Because when the world was asleep, she'd watch him come home at dawn, clothes dirty, eyes tired, hands bleeding from work. He didn't steal money. He stole moments from his own life just to give her a better one. Every extra shift, every unpaid hour, every smile he forced so she wouldn't see his pain. That was her father. She remembered the night they took him. The flashing red and blue lights turned their small apartment into a nightmare. The officers shouted words she didn't understand. Fraud, evidence, arrest. She clutched his leg, crying, begging them not to take him. He looked down, calm somehow, and whispered, "Don't cry, baby girl. I'll be home soon. Be strong for me." But he never came home. Days turned into weeks. She slept on the couch, waiting for footsteps that never returned. She kept his old jacket, folded beside her, and whispered to it at night, as if it could answer. Every morning before school, she'd draw his face on a piece of paper so she wouldn't forget his smile, and on her neck hung a tiny cross, the only gift he'd ever been able to buy her. It wasn't gold. It wasn't perfect, but it shone like hope when the world felt too dark. At school, they called her the thief's daughter. She didn't argue. She didn't cry where they could see. But every time someone laughed, a little more fire burned inside her. Quiet, steady, patient. Her mother tried to protect her from the truth. But children see what silence hides. She heard the phone calls, the lawyers asking for money, the worry in her mother's voice. She heard the words, "He might not come back." And that night, she made herself a promise. If no one believes him, I will. Weeks later, the trial began. Reporters camped outside the courthouse like vultures. Everyone wanted a story, not justice. Inside, her father sat behind glass, tired, pale, but still trying to smile for her. She sat in the front row every day, too small for the chair, but too brave to look away. She watched the prosecutor twist every truth into a lie. She watched people nod, believing words that weren't real. And she watched the judge, cold and distant, as if her father's life were just another file on the desk. Every night she prayed, not for miracles, not for fame, just for one chance, one moment to tell them who her father really was. The man who skipped meals so she could eat, the man who fixed neighbors' cars for free because he couldn't stand to see anyone walk, the man who believed that kindness was stronger than money, and then the chance came. On the final day of the trial, the judge asked if anyone wished to speak before sentencing. The courtroom was silent. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it echo in her ears. Her mother squeezed her hand, a silent plea to stay quiet. But something inside her refused, because she realized if she didn't speak now, no one ever would. She stood, small, trembling, but unbroken. Every head turned. People whispered, confused. The guards looked toward the judge. The judge frowned, ready to stop her, but she took one step forward. Then another. And with every step, she remembered every night she'd prayed, every tear she'd cried, every word her father had ever told her. "Be strong for me." She reached the front, looked up at the man in the black robe, and clutched the tiny cross on her chest. Her voice was soft at first, barely louder than a whisper. "Your Honor." "May I say something?" The room held its breath. And for the first time since the trial began, the judge nodded. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and the world faded away. The crowd, the cameras, the whispers. All that remained was a daughter and her father, and the truth she had carried in her heart for far too long was finally ready to be spoken. She walked toward the stand, each step echoing through the courtroom like thunder. Her shoes were too big, borrowed from her mom, and they tapped against the marble floor as if counting down to something the world wasn't ready for. The judge sighed, already impatient. The lawyers leaned toward one another, whispering, "This is ridiculous." Reporters adjusted their cameras, waiting to capture another headline, "Child interrupts court." But she didn't care. Because for the first time in her life, no one could stop her. She reached the witness stand, too short to reach the microphone. The bailiff tried to help, but she shook her head. She wanted her voice to be heard exactly as it was, small, trembling, but true. The prosecutor smirked. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect, this child doesn't belong here. She doesn't understand the law." The judge looked down. "Little one," he said softly, "why are you here?" She swallowed hard. Her fingers twisted around the tiny cross on her necklace. And then she said, quietly at first, "I'm here because you're about to punish the wrong man," the courtroom murmured. Someone laughed nervously. The prosecutor rolled his eyes. "And how would you know that, sweetheart?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. She looked up, straight into his eyes, and replied, "Because I was there when he didn't do it." The words hung in the air like smoke. The crowd went still. Even the judge froze, pen suspended in midair. Her heart raced. Her palms were sweating. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She took a deep breath and let years of silence pour out. "My dad was at work that night," she said, her voice shaking. "He came home late like always. I remember because it was raining and he carried me from the car so my shoes wouldn't get wet. He gave me his jacket, the same one you took away when you arrested him." She reached into her small backpack and pulled something out, a folded, wrinkled piece of paper. The room watched as she laid it on the desk in front of her. "This is his timesheet," she whispered. "He clocked out at 11:58 p.m. 2 hours after the robbery you said he did. I found it in his old jacket pocket." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor blinked, words suddenly gone. "Sweetheart," the judge said carefully, "did anyone ask you to bring this?" She shook her head. "No, sir. No one believed me. So I kept it safe. Waiting for today." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Because she still had more to say. "You think my dad's just some man who made a mistake. But he's not. He's the one who helps people fix their cars when they can't afford it. He's the one who brings extra food home for our neighbors when he barely has enough for us. And when he tucks me in at night, he says, 'Always tell the truth, even if it shakes your voice.'" Her voice did shake, but it never broke. Every word cut deeper than any lawyer's argument. Every pause felt heavier than the judge's gavel. The prosecutor tried to recover. "Anyone could have written that timesheet," he said, but his tone had lost its confidence. The girl looked at him, eyes fierce, filled with the kind of strength that only comes from pain. "Then look at the signature," she said quietly. "It's yours. You signed it when you visited his job to question him." The room erupted. Reporters jumped from their seats. The judge slammed the gavel for silence, and through all the chaos, the little girl stood still, not smiling, not crying, just breathing. Because she had finally done what she came for. She had spoken the truth. The judge rubbed his temples, papers rustling, trying to process what he'd just heard. The defense attorney, stunned, asked the bailiff to collect the paper, and as the document passed from hand to hand, the weight of it settled over everyone. For years, they had called her father a liar. In 30 seconds, his daughter had become his voice. She stepped back from the stand slowly, knees shaking. The courtroom blurred, flashes, whispers, disbelief. But she felt lighter, freer, almost like she could breathe again, because for the first time since the night they took her father away, she knew. She had finally been heard. The judge called for a recess, voice trembling. The prosecutor sat down defeated. Her mother covered her mouth, tears spilling silently, and the little girl walked back to her seat, clutching the cross on her necklace like a medal of honor. She didn't know what would happen next, but deep down, she felt something shift. The truth had finally entered the room, and nothing could silence it now. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. Whispers turned into chaos. Lawyers flipped through papers, judges exchanged glances, cameras clicked like 1,000 heartbeats. But in the middle of all that noise, she stood still. Her small hands trembled as she reached into her backpack again. Everyone thought she was done, that the paper was all she had. But no one was ready for what came next. She pulled out an old, cracked voice recorder, the kind her dad used to use when practicing songs for her at night. It looked harmless, almost like a toy. But when she held it up, the entire room seemed to lean forward. "Your Honor," she said softly, This will tell you the truth." The prosecutor's face drained of color. He recognized it. The defense lawyer froze mid-breath. The judge lifted a trembling hand. "Go ahead, child," he whispered. "Play it." Her thumb hovered over the play button. For a moment, she hesitated, the world holding its breath with her. And then, click. A faint static filled the courtroom speakers. Then a voice. A man's voice, smooth, confident, but cold. The room went dead silent. "Yeah, it's done," the voice said. "Blame Johnson. He's perfect for it. Poor guy can't afford a lawyer anyway. It'll blow over." Her father's name, Johnson. The same man sitting in chains, watching his little girl fight for him. The audience gasped. One woman covered her mouth. A man dropped his pen. Even the judge's eyes widened in disbelief. The voice continued. "Just make sure the paperwork looks clean. The company can't afford another scandal. You understand me?" It was the father's boss, the man who had accused him. The man who sat in the front row, calm and confident. Until now. Every eye turned toward him. He shifted in his seat, sweat glistening on his forehead. "That's not me!" he shouted suddenly. "This is edited. She's lying!" But the girl didn't flinch. She pressed the recorder closer to the mic. "Play it till the end," she said quietly. The static crackled again. Then came the final words, low, mocking, cruel. "Don't worry," the boss laughed in the recording. "They'll never believe a poor man's kid anyway." The words hit like thunder. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, outrage, reporters shouting questions. The judge slammed the gavel once, twice. "Order!" he yelled. But even his voice trembled. Her father sat frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling. Tears rolled down his face, his hands shaking as the cuffs clinked softly against each other. And his daughter, that small, trembling girl, stood taller than anyone else in that room. Because in one moment she had broken every wall built by power and lies. The prosecutor stood slowly, stammering. "Your Honor, I need time to—" "Enough," the judge interrupted sharply. "That recording will be verified immediately. Bailiff, detain Mr. Harrison." The room exploded again. The boss, the real criminal, tried to stand, but the officers were already behind him. They grabbed his arms, forcing him back down. He shouted, "You can't do this! She's a child! This is insane!" But no one listened, because the truth was louder than his screams. The girl watched as they took him away, her tiny hands still gripping the recorder like a sword. For the first time, the cameras that once pointed at her father now turned toward the real culprit. The judge's voice softened. "Little girl," he said, "what made you record this?" She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, and said, "Because my dad always told me, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard." The judge leaned back, covering his mouth with his hand. He had presided over hundreds of trials, but never one like this. Never a truth so pure, so painful, and so brave. Her father tried to stand, but his knees gave out. The bailiff helped him up, and when their eyes met, father and daughter, The world seemed to fade. No courtroom. No judge, no cameras. Just them. A promise kept. A truth set free. You did it, he whispered. She smiled through tears. No, Daddy, she said. We did it. The judge struck the gavel one last time. The echo rolled through the room like thunder. Case reopened, he declared. Mr. Johnson, you are to be released pending review. And as for this evidence, and it will change everything. The audience stood in silence. Some clapped softly. Others just cried. Reporters lowered their cameras. For once, two moved to film. The little girl turned to leave, still clutching her recorder. And as she walked out of that courtroom, her small footsteps sounded like victory drums. The voice of power had been silenced. The voice of truth had spoken. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the ones in suits. Sometimes it comes from the smallest voice in the room, the one brave enough to say, "You're wrong." That day, the courtroom didn't just hear a recording. It heard redemption. It heard love. It heard the sound of chains breaking. Not metal ones, but the invisible ones that keep the poor unheard. And as the door closed behind her, everyone inside knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was silent, not because of fear, but because truth had finally spoken. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the man in chains took one trembling step forward. His daughter ran to him before anyone could stop her. The sound of her shoes against the floor echoed like freedom's heartbeat. And when her little arms wrapped around him, it wasn't just a hug. It was a promise kept, a wound closing, a miracle finally seen. He knelt to the ground, holding her so tightly it looked like he was afraid she might vanish. Tears streamed down his face, falling on her hair, his voice barely a whisper. "You saved me," he said. But she shook her head gently, looking up through tears. "No, Daddy." The truth did. Around them, cameras that once hunted humiliation now captured redemption. Reporters lowered their mics. Some of them, the same ones who had called him guilty on live TV, wiped their eyes in silence. Even the judge, stern and cold for decades, removed his glasses and let out a long, shaky breath. For once, justice felt human again. The bailiff unlocked the cuffs. The sound of the chains hitting the floor was soft, but it thundered through every heart in the room. He reached for his daughter's hand, his fingers trembling as if touching the world for the first time in years. They stood together, small and strong, facing the same people who had once looked down on them. The prosecutor lowered his head. The jury, once uncertain, now stood in quiet respect. And from the back of the room, someone whispered, "Truth has no age." The words rippled through the courtroom like wind through the trees. Light. Pure, undeniable. The father turned to the judge, voice cracking but proud. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. But the judge shook his head. "Don't thank me," he replied softly. "Thank the little girl who reminded this court what justice truly means." Outside, the city was waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones reached forward, but she hid behind her father's coat. Shy, quiet, still that same little girl who had once just wanted her dad back. Reporters shouted questions. "How did you find the recording?" "What will you do now?" But she only smiled, holding her father's hand tighter, whispering, "We're going home." That night, they walked down a long street, the same one she used to cross alone every day to visit him in prison. But this time she wasn't crying. This time she was humming, the same lullaby he used to sing before everything went wrong. Streetlights flickered above them, like stars bowing to a new dawn. He looked at her, eyes soft and proud. "You were never afraid, were you?" he asked. She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "I was," she said. "But you always told me, brave isn't the one who feels no fear. It's the one who stands up anyway," he smiled. That smile, tired, grateful, alive, said everything. No courtroom, no money, no title could ever measure what he felt at that moment. Because his freedom wasn't written on paper. It was written in her heart. As they reached home, a small apartment barely lit, he stopped at the door. For years, that door had stayed closed, gathering dust. Now, it opened to the sound of laughter and light. He picked up the same cross necklace that had fallen from her neck during the trial. He placed it back gently, saying, "This isn't just faith anymore. This is proof that love never loses." The news spread overnight. Headlines read, "Little girl saves her father with truth." Social media called her the voice of justice. But she didn't care about fame or interviews. The next morning, while the world spoke her name, she made breakfast for her dad. Eggs, toast, and a small cup of coffee, just like he used to make. And when he smiled across the table, she whispered, "See? Told you I'd bring you home." Days later, the court officially cleared his name. The real culprit confessed. And when reporters asked the judge what changed his mind, he said, "It wasn't the evidence alone. It was the courage of a child who reminded us all why truth matters." That single line became history. Schools printed it on posters. People shared the clip across the world. And somewhere, in a little girl's heart, the weight of injustice finally lifted. Because that day wasn't about winning a case. It was about proving that even in a world full of power, lies, and noise, the truth still finds a way to be heard. It may come from small lips. It may come through tears. But when it comes, nothing can silence it. Her story became a symbol, not of pain, but of promise. Of a daughter's love that refused to surrender. Of a father who never stopped believing. Of a justice system reminded that hearts can speak louder than rules. Years later, when she grew up, someone asked her what she remembered most about that day. She smiled and said, "The silence." The moment everyone finally listened. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that. Her father walked free, but that truth walked with him. Because truth doesn't need power to be strong. It doesn't need a voice to be loud. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it, no matter how small they are. That day, the world saw it. A little girl who didn't just defend her father. She freed him, and in doing so, she freed us all from the belief that age, status, or silence could ever stop what's right. Because in the end, truth has no age, and love has no limits.